Let's get across some of the detail of the inflation number with Michelle Marquardt, who is the head of prices statistics at the Bureau of Statistics. Michelle, thanks for your time. Can you just explain the main influences on this 21-year high for inflation today?
Thanks, Ross. Yes, we've seen a number of different influences across the inflation figures today. So primarily around new dwellings and fuel, and they had a couple of different influences. So that was mainly around supply shortages and for the housing. And obviously the Ukraine war has had an impact on oil prices, so that's still flowing through to petrol prices, despite the fact that there was a drop in the excise for fuel. We still saw a strong growth in fuel across the quarter.
OK, that's worth picking up, isn't it? Because the government took action to take the excise away, and yet notwithstanding that, that should have actually reduced inflation in normal times. But in actual fact, the price rises were so great that that was simply subsumed by those increases in fuel prices.
That's exactly right. So in March, we saw the excise... Sorry, in April we saw the excise cause a drop in the fuel prices, but by the end of June they'd popped back up again to be even higher than they were in March.
There were some other aspects of it, food prices, vegetable prices. These were higher during this period of time. It's hard to know always whether this is seasonal or whether this is actually something which is a bit systemic, perhaps caused by higher fuel prices and fertiliser prices. That's always something that you've got to drill down into a bit, don't you?
Yeah, there were a couple of things that we saw going on there. So obviously the freight prices going up with the fuel price going up, but also floods were a big contributor, particularly for vegetables. So the flooding in New South Wales and Queensland impacted a lot of growing areas. So that caused a shortage of supply. I think everyone will remember the cost of lettuces went through the roof. So that was reflected in our vegetable prices in particular.
One thing that people will recognise that the Reserve Bank looks at is the underlying rate of inflation. Now, I noticed today that the underlying rate of inflation at 4.9% was higher than the market had anticipated. Just explain the drivers of that.
Yeah, so for the trimmed mean, what we do is we remove the very low price rises and the very high price rises and look at what's left. And what was interesting this time, and in fact last quarter, was that by the time we'd done that, there were no negative movements left in that series. So it was particularly high. It was the highest that we've seen since the series started in 2003. And that just really reflects the fact that the price changes were really broad-based and across a lot of goods and services.
But there were a couple of things that were falling in price, but oddly these were government-inspired. One of them was childcare costs. And indeed, in New South Wales, urban transport costs were cut as well.
Yes, that's right. There were very few things that fell in price, but they were the main ones. So for childcare, the rebate for people with more than 2 children in childcare went up in March, and that flowed through to this last quarter. And in Sydney and Hobart, those state governments offered people free transport to get people back using public transport, and that came through as a fall this quarter.
Yeah. And I've got only a couple of seconds to go, but I understand you're now working on monthly inflation numbers as compared with the traditional quarterly numbers. How far along are you in that exercise?
Yeah, so it's coming along really well. We're going to put out an information paper next month, and then that will be open for public comment for about a month or so after that. So it's looking good so far.
I'll tell you what, Michelle Marquardt, many thanks for your time. The head of this area of statistics at the Australian Bureau of Statistics, putting out those inflation numbers today. Many thanks.
Thanks, Ross.